Welcome to Linking into Sales, the social selling podcast with myself and in spirit and intent, Greg Hire and Elise Archer. Greg's on something called a vacation. I'm self-employed. I'm still trying to figure out what that is. And then Elise is busy taking care of clients, but brought in questions. And I am so excited with our guest today, a good friend and fan, David Amerland. Now, Amerland, did I get your name correct this time?
You did, absolutely.
All
Yes.
right, great. My wife was coaching in me. I'm a little dyslexic, and once I get it wrong, I'm dangerous. So we're going to go over a few bits of news, but the big topic today is going to be, are you sharing useful content or fake news? This whole conversation is affecting everything on the internet, and when I thought I want to have a conversation on it, you were the man I wanted to get involved in it, and I'm so excited to jump into this conversation. We're going to go over a few news items first, and I thought we'd do something different today. I thought we'd discuss it together because Greg usually curates our news tips, and the first news item is Twitter app has done a major upgrade. And of course, those of us, we all say we want change until it happens, and then we have growth experiences on it. But there's a lot of look and feel changes, and let's explore it together since it's you and I today. David, what's your view of the new Twitter?
Well, Twitter's been struggling, and I must preface this and say that Twitter has been a favorite of many marketers. A lot of people start the day with it because it gives us a cross-section of the world, and we get a very sort of almost raw feel of what's happening. So it is important to many of us. We don't want to see it go away. It has been struggling. Its monetization policy has been failing consistently. More worrying, its engagement has been going down over the last few months on a steady basis. So essentially, they're experimenting to see what will actually help. And since we're talking about fake news and the problem with not perhaps correct information being spread, Twitter has also been instrumental in this happening. So it's at the very core of many of the issues we actually face on the web. The new design is welcome in terms that it creates a degree of familiarity with people who are familiar with the web, and even those who are unfamiliar with it, because they see things they see in terms of icons and approach and feel that they see elsewhere. Will it really help in terms of engagement? The jury's still out there. Will it help in terms of the quality of information that gets spread through it? Well, that we need to see.
That's excellent. And you're right. It does tie into the discussion today because since what we've learned years ago is when you can be anonymous, you get both the truth and the abuse, versus LinkedIn where it kind of slows us down because the name's attached,
Absolutely.
And I also love Twitter because it's a global conversation I can find out. I hear something in the news, I go to Twitter and I know both the hearsay and the news, but you have to filter it. So I think it's related to the topic today too. And we want to hear what other people think of it. We'll put in the show notes an article we have on it from TechCrunch. But the other topic that Greg brought forward is the importance that LinkedIn needs to understand this idea of harassment from people at work and sexual harassment with LinkedIn and who's liable. So if you're at work and you're on LinkedIn, what is the liability risk? And I think that's a interesting discussion too, which might be another show. But we have to realize our employees are going to be in a social space during the work time, and how does that affect our liability? So I'll let you add anything you want to it, David.
Well, this is part and parcel of the challenge of the digital age, where you cannot realistically hope to quarantine your employees from the digital space. And it brings in the very interesting question, how liable are you for their behavior? If some of the things they do happen during work time and perhaps even using work equipment. Hugely thorny issue on many sides, from a social perspective, from a work perspective, and certainly from a legal perspective. It hasn't been worked out. The best approach here is for companies to have a very clearly thought through social media policy that everybody understands and everybody's part of the discussion. I must say it happens very rarely at the moment, in my opinion, simply because the people who make those decisions in the C-suite still don't quite get it. So here we are.
Well, it's interesting you said that because, as you know, I also teach the social media management certificate program in NC State University Technology Training Solution. And the topic today was the importance of having a thought through social media policy. And you make sure employees not only sign it, but sign it when they're employed because it's harder to do retroactively, but also
Yes.
make sure they understand because we have people from multicultural backgrounds and multi levels of support and upbringing. We have some very good people that their parents might have been so busy they didn't get the that's not appropriate behavior, and not assuming common sense is common anymore. So to spell it out, and I think this is related to that.
It is, and I think you bringing up something really important here. Common sense essentially is when a group of people operate from the same understood background, which makes certain things socially acceptable or even professionally acceptable. And that implies a certain baseline in terms of cultural awareness and cultural sort of synthesizers that create behavioral modalities. And when we have perhaps business people who are working across different cultures. We have different people from different ethnic backgrounds coming into businesses for a short time and leaving again. This creates a dynamic that hasn't been addressed simply because most companies didn't think it would be a big problem, but evidently it is, and it's something we need to look at.
Excellent. Well, those were the two news items. We'll have some resources in the link. I do want to mention our sponsor, which is our social selling training. Make sure to check that out. That's social selling training. We have a fundamentals of social selling where we've worked long and hard on, and we can see the light at the end of the tunnel. It's not a train for it, but those who have already joined the social selling training will get it, and we'll be rolling out the updates to LinkedIn as well. We wanted to give it a good 6 months. It's such a major change, and we'll be updating all of our LinkedIn training there. So that's worth checking out. And I'm going to add one more plug. Please, if you like the show, go to iTunes and write a review. And if you don't like it, write a review too. We want to hear your thoughts and views on it. We've fallen down on the job and not asking for reviews on that area, and we're now requesting them. So please let us hear from you. I love to hear them. So today's show with David Amerland is this topic of are you curating accurate news or not? And in some ways, David, this is a cloaked way for me to have a talk with you about this whole global conversation of influence and fake news. And before we dig in, I'd like to just mention, I want to kind of give a little bio of you and my experience of you, and so people know who's talking here. I see you as a global thought leader. You were the first person that really taught me how to understand the major changes to the Hummingbird upgrade in Google. That's where I dug into your work. And you've been taking on cutting edge marketing and life and mobile and technology issues, from ethics to marketing to machine learning. It's like if it's new and cutting edge and complicated problems, you're drawn to it and solving it. And now you have a new book coming out as well. But is there anything I left out of that except pay attention what David has to say?
No, I think you covered everything pretty neatly.
Good. And what I love is you really work hard to take complicated issues and make them accessible to the most people, and
Yeah. That's
that's
what
to me a
fascinates
passion
me
you
as
have.
well.
Go ahead.
Thank you. I was going to say that's what fascinates me because before the web, before social media came along, I used to work within corporate compounds, essentially in silos, and I did very specific work that went to great depth and was very technical. But it only benefited specific people within the organization. And I think we can all benefit from understanding the broader issues that work impacts upon. And these days, work, technology, and life tend to sort of come together very quickly. And that's when things get extremely interesting.
Excellent. And another thing I acknowledge is you really work hard to see people across as I want to say like equals. The world is flat because you I showed interest in your work and developed it, and we've been able to build a friendship at a global level, and you have as well, and you are a filter to see the people, individuals at a very high level that I don't see as often. So I really want to acknowledge you bring heart and values and intellect into the picture. So that's been both valuable to me, but also I want models like you in the world because it helps me inspire to be a better person too, and you're one of them. So that's
Thank you very much.
yeah, what I like to
That's good.
say. So now let's move into the topic. How do you know you're not sharing fake news?
Isn't that a thorny question? Well, funnily enough, the moment we have any kind of disruption to the status of technology, we are opening up the door wide open to the thorny issue of veracity. And that is, how do you differentiate fact from opinion when they can both travel very quickly using the exact same channel? And it used to be that, when things are sort of set, the channel itself is the filter. So, if we only have, for instance, magazines, it's expensive to set up a magazine. The moment you see something printed there, well, it instantly has a greater intrinsic value than something that which, you perhaps get in a handwritten note somebody's given you. But all these things have sort of, technology gives us constantly more and more access to information and more access to channels to propagate that information. And it constantly brings down the cost of actually doing so. And as it does that, it tends to become an equalizer. So a lie, however elaborate or however poorly be dressed now, as in the same clothes as a truth. From the perspective of the person receiving this, well, you can't really differentiate one from the other, which is a problem, unless you actually are prepared to do some work. And in the past we weren't, but now we have to. And here's where things actually begin to become extremely interesting. The question is always, how do you make sure that the information that you have come across actually has some value in terms of its factual basis, and it has some authority in terms of any interpretation that you may have added to it. And there are two factors here. Now, the most immediate one is the most human one. Essentially, the ability to tell truth from lies has always been something which we have struggled with, even within small communities. And our instant response to that is, as people, to develop authoritative sources as contacts. To give a classic example, if we go back to the Middle Ages, we tended to trust the priest, the lawyer, and perhaps the statesman, simply because reputationally they had too much to lose by telling a simple, blatant lie. So although we may not always accept that they tell the truth 100% of the time, overall, they were more trustworthy sources. As we move forward now, we have to create our own social network of people we can trust, whether these people are somebody we have come across in our day-to-day working life, somebody we have met online, and over a course of interactions and engagement, we have come to value their judgment and trust what they say. And the question of trust now as an element comes into all this, and how we actually define this. And we define it in terms of understanding the motivation of other people, understanding what actually makes them say and do what they do, and the value of what they actually get from their actions. So if we, which is how we create trust in the real world. If we start creating that network as people initially, we create a ready sort of made filter through which we can run most of the things which we come across. Now, if that isn't available for whatever reason, or if the information we have come across is a little bit more complicated and perhaps our own social network of contacts can filter, then there are specific websites which have been created which allow us to do that. Now, for political news, it's obvious, there's factcheck.org, for instance, there's politifact.com, there's snopes.com. But for most things which you may want to check, if you go to reporterslab.org, they basically have a fact-checking database which allows you to check things within your state, within your sort of area, and it will tell you which organizations actually do that. These are supported by people who are either reporters or they're volunteers, and their entire mission is to fact check things and make sure that they're factually correct. So there's no spin in terms of interpretation.
That's excellent. And so several things I want to get is that we brought up. Number one is the importance with speed of execution being so critical, the importance of building your network of trusted allies, that you go, most of the time, I know they're biased and I know what they're accurate on. So if you go, I might have an ally that I know I can trust him when he talks about computers, but I may not trust him on politics, and so forth, because of and understanding the bias of each one of these sources. The second is some of the sites that are coming on, to double check content is important and to know what they are. And we'll probably put those in the show notes as well.
Yes.
Some of the ones you recommend. And then I was thinking as you're speaking, why don't I want to back up a little bit and ask the question, what is news? And I'll start with my definition and then add it, because I'm really starting to think in America, because I watch both the top political parties, CNN and Fox. Oh, I'm sorry, those are news stations, and BBC. I have them all on my button, in MSNBC, and between them, I kind of average what the heck's going on in the world. And listening to them, the question is, I think of news as what is verifiable by the senses of the person there. So if I take this pen and drop it, what occurred is I dropped the pen, and the interpretation is Martin got angry and dropped the pen. And I think that's leading the charge now, because of the need to get eyeballs and attention on the site way before even finding out that I dropped the pin. The fact is Martin just dropped a pin at this interval. And I go up to DC where my parents are, and several people are very fond of the Washington Post, for example. I met someone who says, I got to stop following it because I can't find out what happened. There's so much commentary. So let's start with your definition of what is news, and then what is commentary.
Okay, Essentially, news is anything which is factual and is actually being reported. And by factually means independently verifiable by X number of people from both sides of whatever divide you're standing on. So if we can all agree that this has happened, then we get to the state of, what is the importance, what is the relevance of that event? And this is where things get very thorny very quickly. Now, essentially, and this is something which is scientifically verifiable. Two people can look at the same facts. They can agree that the facts are exactly what they are, but they will not agree on their interpretation of those facts. And they will both be adamant that they're correct. And you say, how can this possibly happen? Well, every time we filter anything which we regard to be truth, we filter through our own experience, our own expectations, and our own perceptions. Those perceptions and those expectations are going to put a spin essentially on what we've seen in terms of what its importance is. So to get back to your example, you dropped the pen. Well, somebody will say you were angry and you threw the pen. And somebody else will say, well, you've got some sort of pathological disorder and you go neurological damage. You can't even hold the pen. Now, both of these things, depending on the context, can be incredibly sensitive, incredibly damning, and incredibly important. If you're being vetted, for example, to fly a plane, having some kind of neurological disorder where you can't even hold a pen, critical to you not doing so. If you are being vetted for a leadership position, being unable to hold your anger in public can also be very important. So the spin we put on these things is critical. And it is always very important to be able to differentiate between the interpretation and the facts. And even when we go to a news site, they will always have a thin layer of interpretation on top of that. The BBC arguably is one of the least biased websites, news organizations in the world, but even so, they will have a slight spin, which I suppose you could call it's leftward leaning. If you go to Fox, it could be right word. If you go to CNN, it could be somewhere in between. So we need to be aware of these things. We could say that we need things to be factual from a news organization, but that also flies in the face of the argument that reporters who report on things constantly from different areas of the world are also perhaps the ones who are best suited sometimes to create context by adding their perception of what's happening. The moment we accept that, because that's the value of a reporter, then it lays the pavement for the slippery slope to an opinionated website or an opinionated news organization that simply begins to spin things more and more and more and more until we get to the point that the interpretation of facts is so biased that it begins to sort of devalue the facts themselves.
Yeah, and I think part of it is realizing as a human being, I am going to have unconscious bias that maybe I don't know, and keep a watchful observer on it is the way I view it. And I've been told sometimes not many people realize that. I mean, I know all my upbringing and everything else, and in context, especially if I get emotionally charged, I will go to other people I trust to say, "What's your perspective on it?" Because usually I think our own bias go up the more either we add personal at stake with it or emotionally charged to it as well. And I think this is a time in history where it's really important that the news make sure that they're identifying what actually happened and then identifying the credibility of it. One of the things in the election, to not get too political, is I would hear something that the current president would say on his campaign, and then I'd hear the news saying something different from it. I'm going, if you just reported what happened, it was pretty dramatic, but now you distorted the information, so I've lost credibility of you. And I think, and I've seen it on both. It's like there seems to be a lack of accountability on the news and the rest of us of getting back to what is news, and I'm trying to responsibly challenge myself in it as well.
I think your personal strategy is a good one, and it's one that we can all adopt essentially. Having a social network that's widespread enough to allow us to attain a certain level of balance is critically important in these times. Most of us globally tend to live in enclaves where birds of a feather roost together, and that creates perception bubbles. So being able to break through them, and we have the technology to actually do that, allows us to attain a more balanced perspective. Bias is always going to be there, but the moment we actually actively begin to mediate against that, the degree of impartiality which we can attain is always going to be higher than if we didn't.
I'd like you to talk about that perception bubble, because the way I realized it is, in life I've attempted to look at people that annoyed me or really made me angry, and then start seeing what's in me that triggers that. And I've built some of the best allies with people initially I just didn't like, because I went, why am I charged? And there's a concept that I can't be angry with another person if there isn't an aspect of that in me. And I don't fully understand that, but it's been a very useful inquiry. So would you talk about the perception bubble, and also how this is related to you grabbing biased news and not sharing it in the sales cycle?
Yes, definitely. Okay, all these things are related, and you're right. It comes down to the individual, us essentially, and how willing we are to do that introspective work and actually understand what's happening. If something triggers us because of the way somebody said, that's the most illogical thing in the world. Most of the times, that person is, an avatar or a name on a screen, and you've seen a message. And your emotional response to that, our emotional response, is very real. We become very fired up. We become very sort of driven in our interpretation of what's been said and the importance behind it. And even more importantly, we tend to read intent which allows us to make an assessment of threat levels, and that's the way we're hardwired. And then we respond accordingly in defensive mode, or even worse, in attack mode or a counter-attack mode. And then things escalate from there. So essentially, we need to understand that everything we do in the online world, whether it's aggressive or not, whether the perception of it is aggressive or not, is communication. We are all trying to do the same thing. We're trying to communicate, we're trying to connect at some level, and we're all trying to share information, share our values, share our vision, and actually find some kind of resonance. Now, when we do that with people who 100% agree with us, all we're doing is amplifying each other's biases. So pretty much, we get into it's, the world is black or the world is white kind of thing, and we all agree on that, and that's it. Anybody who says anything else must obviously be a heretic, and we all know what fate awaits heretics in this world. So that's the way we go. But if we break through that, suddenly we realize the world isn't black or white. It's shades of gray, and they have different importance and different perspective. And that allows us to broaden our own perspective. We have to increase our knowledge in order to understand what's happening. We have to work harder in ourselves so we don't overreact every time. We have to be able to understand the perspective of particular things to which we have no direct experience of. And that's where our social networks come into play. That's where our connections come into play. And all that now requires an extremely high cognitive load because everything is intentional. We don't, if we live digitally, and most of us do, we're here by design. It's not like we step out a front door and we have a body which has to occupy a specific space. And there's a neighbor who also has a body which occupies a specific space, and we say hi because we can't avoid each other. Now, every connection is intentional, every reaction is intentional, everything which affects us, we have the ability to step away from, and if we don't, then we are responsible for that. And this is a highly charged state of being most of the time. We're not really ready for it. And that takes personal defense strategies, which we need to start developing. It takes specific approaches. And whether we use that information for our personal gratification in terms of widening our sense of what's happening in the world by understanding the news and connecting with people, or going even into the marketing side and the branding side, where we do something very specific. All these things now have to be incredibly measured. We really need to think through what they are, the impact they're going to have, and how we're going to deal with it in the long term, because that comes right back to us. The internet has a long memory.
Yeah, and I want to talk about two things with this that you brought up: is amplifying our bias, and what are signs that you're doing it. And I also want to talk about in sales today, in social selling, we need to walk in our customers' world deeper than our competition. So we're anticipating problems that our competition may not even be aware of.
Yes.
So I think one would be is what is a red flag to you when you might be just amplifying your own bias, or some you can make it personal or not. I mean, to me, one of it is I'm starting to see the world just as black and white. That's a warning sign for me. I'm just amplifying my own bias. But what are your views on that?
Well, Einstein said that everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler. And I'm paraphrasing just a little bit. And I think that's a
Yeah.
good strategy, or a good sort of assessment filter to have for how things are. The world has always been very complex. Our natural defense mechanism to that is to simplify it through mental heuristics that allow us to create small tribal groups where what connects us is very instant and very visual. We're all the same color, we all have the same hair color, our eyes are the same, and so when we speak the same language, we all salute the same flag. That worked when the world was small and we were small and things moved slowly. When the world is smaller, but there's more of us on it and everything moves really quickly, that doesn't work anymore. So essentially, what we need to be able to do now is actually filter everything through a complexity level. And if we think, this is complex, I mean, we know things are complicated. We know that there are unintended consequences to every action. If we say blithely, no, there aren't, this is what it is, because I'm only willing to look 1 inch ahead of me. Well, knowingly, we're blinkering ourselves. And I think in a digital age, none of us can really knowledgeably afford to do that. So when we do it, we are reacting because we fear uncertainty, because we fear the things which we would possibly face ahead of us or even within us. And again, the mechanism which we have to cope with all this is inherently a social one. We should not be alone, because no matter how strong, clever, smart, or wonderful, brilliant we may be, alone, eventually we break, and we break very quickly and perhaps very deeply. So we should have an active social network which allows us to balance ourselves. And a social network, in terms of balancing, should have a bit of yin and yang. We can't all be blonde-haired, blue-eyed in one group singing the same song. Because if that happens, well, we are basically creating an enclave. We're locking ourselves in that silo, and we're refusing to accept that anything outside it has any kind of credence or countenance. So essentially, we should be able to widen, broaden our horizons. We should be looking for challenges, and each challenge is an opportunity for growth. And is it painful? Absolutely, because every time we struggle, the pain circuits in our head are the exact same pain circuits that actually process pain, physical pain. So the discomfort we feel when somebody on a screen challenges with 3 lines which make our head spin is pretty much the same kind of discomfort that we would feel if somebody slapped us in the face. And then it takes real awareness, sort of take a step back, take a deep breath, consider that, and consider why this is happening and what the implications are and how we should respond. And if we take that into a business setting now where we're actually selling things, if we haven't got empathy for our public, for our audience, if we don't understand their real need for something, then all we're doing is saying, buy our stuff. It doesn't matter what that stuff is, we just want them to buy it. And we think that the more forceful we are and the louder we yell, the more likely they are to capitulate and actually buy it, when in fact, the opposite is happening. We're creating defenses which we'll find very hard to basically overcome. So in order for us to connect with anybody, and it doesn't matter the setting now or the context, it could be a political conversation, it could be a social conversation, or it could be a selling context conversation. In order to connect with the other person, we need to be able to understand what is their need, what is their perspective, how does what we do, what we say, affect them. And if we can actually understand these 3 things, then we're in a position to create a connection, and a connection then creates a relationship, and the relationship changes everything else.
Excellent, excellent, and I agree with you. And part of this is I talk about in the social selling as well as social media is we have to know the core principles and values we have that aren't movable, and then we need to learn to see through their eyes as looking back at us and other perspectives. I think both are needed, because if you're only over there, then you don't have guiding principles to operate out of. And if you're only over here, you look like someone who has no compassion and massively insensitive. Would you agree in a synopsis of that?
Absolutely, and I think I'm very glad you brought up values now, because essentially, before we can actually step outside ourselves and connect with somebody else, we must intrinsically understand who we are. We must understand the why of us. Why are we who we are? Why are we doing what we're doing? Why do we persist? Why are these things important to us? In order to understand those things, we need to understand our own values. And if we understand our own values, then we begin to find commonalities with the people we're actually talking to. But more importantly, we're also creating the boundaries. What are sort of red lines? What are the things which will not cross over? Because let's face it, in a digital space, it is very easy to be very malleable and change very quickly and morph from A to Z. And it is also very easy to get into this popularity contest where you say anything to anyone in order to get what you want. And I think these things, first of all, you'll be found out eventually, because it's a very public thing and it creates a lot of distrust. But the other thing, of course, is it doesn't convince anybody for very long, because you lack conviction yourself. You're constantly looking to see what is the other person expects to hear, so you can say it, and that comes across. So working out our own values, what is important to us, allows us then to actually create value in the interaction. If you, for instance, are the kind of person who will always say, hey, this is wrong and this is why it's wrong, and it doesn't matter how aggressive it may be or how adversarial the conversation, you can always be trusted to say exactly the right thing because it's the right thing to say. well, you may rile a few people, but those people also begin to respect that because they think, okay, it's true. Okay, I don't agree with that, but what he said is true, and I need to think about it. And that begins to give value to truth. This is why we hate lies. We hate lies not because we all engage at some point to some kind of white lying at some part of our lives, if not all our lives. Truth is a very sort of slippery thing. It's there in proportions, but not 100%. And yet, we all value truth. We value truth because the moment it doesn't matter, the moment that it can be anything, then things degrade to such an extent that there's no value in anything. And we need things to have value, because without value, there's nothing worth striving for. And without anything worth striving for, there's no purpose. And without purpose, life becomes very meaningless very quickly.
I'm smiling because I remember the first time I had a housemate. I often had male housemates when I was single, and I had a woman housemaid. And the time she was like the best housemaid ever, renting a room. And she says, "Does this jeans make me look fat?" I had no reference, but the answer was no. And then I thought, did I just lie? Because I wasn't paying attention enough to answer it, And I think it's important to hold that we do compromise ethics in little ways, and not act like we don't. Just go, okay, I just lied there. You know what I mean? And be honest to ourselves with it, because I believe the highway to hell is paved with 10,000 justification. And that's what happens in corporate worlds, with tiny little steps that get them there. I want to move to some of our other good questions here. But one of the stories I remembered is, with this show coming up, I notice often in speaking, I'd make a comment like, it's just like boiling a frog alive. And I'd make it as an analogy. So with ours coming up and me kind of looking at myself for the presentation, I looked it up and found out it's a folklore that apparently has no ground in truth, that I've used for several years in talks from time to time. The idea is, if you turn the heat up slowly on a frog, it won't jump out and they can boil alive. I made the analogy of not being aware of things. And I looked it up, went, I've been like telling a lie here and not aware of it. So I think having a compassionate observer of ourselves for our own, knowing that our biases, is part of having an ethical system. And I also believe sometimes values need to be just chosen and committed to, because growing up with my own learning challenges, it was kind of a blur to me, even though I had good parents. And I finally went, I need to pick some values I'm not moving on, because I was a very pleasing person. And my life started working with the both of those that occurred. So, I think truthfulness in news, but truthfulness to ourselves and continuity over time is important for building real trust in allies.
Absolutely. And I think you mentioned a few things here which are really important. And one is the intuitive approach to truth, where we say something which we generally believe because it's been said for a long time. And that is not necessarily true. I mean, what makes our content, if we're creating content, valuable is the effort, the amount of effort we've actually put in there in terms of understanding it, quantifying it, and adding educational value layers to it. So if we're creating content for any specific reason, it is up to us to make sure that the responsible thing to do is to actually fact check pretty much everything we say. Or if not fact check it in detail, at least be able to justify it in terms of its existence and so on. So we need to do all that work. And if the work has been done, that content then becomes valuable because it has a higher degree of trustworthiness, a higher degree of truth, a higher degree of potential connectivity with the audience. And that then allows us to create a kind of credibility which we want, which is how that content will be perceived.
And it's okay to have someone in your team do the research on it. Double check me on this. I've done that, where I've paid someone to research, because I'm not a natural researcher like you, to double check things. I think that's excellent. Well, I want to move. We've got a few questions from Greg and Elise. I want to include them because they're so rich questions. Make sure we're covering them. And one of the ones is the spread of fake content and fake news a problem for sales professionals, in your opinion? I thought that was a really good question Greg asked. And what's your views on that?
It is, absolutely. And it is for two reasons. Okay, the primary reason is that it is more likely these days to include some quote, some level of interpretation to something which we share, which comes from a slightly suspect source or a source we haven't double checked, or perhaps it ticks all our own intuitive buttons, but it's not necessarily true. And if we actually share that, then we are tarred with the same brush. We begin to become less credible, less trustworthy. Now, the second thing, however, which is secondary but even more important, is that the widespread use of fake news and untrustworthy information is beginning to erode trust in pretty much all content providers equally.
Mhm.
So then everybody's tarred with the same brush because the channels are the same. Everybody has a website, everybody quotes some kind of source. There's studies and counter studies about pretty much anything. I can pretty much give you some studies which show that cigarettes are not so bad for your health, for
Mhm.
instance. And we all know that this is not true, but those studies do exist. So essentially, the danger is that if we don't do our due diligence, if that due diligence isn't guided by very specific principles to which we actually subscribe to and adhere to, then the content which we create will have holes in it, which eventually will make it collapse in terms of its credibility, in terms of its trustworthiness. So yes, it's become harder for sales professionals now to create content that actually has that level of credibility. But because there's extra effort involved, it is also perhaps, I could say, easier to create an authoritative presence by sharing content which is trustworthy.
Oh, great. That cuts through the noise. I think that's really good. And the importance of it. And because I'm working on an article on AI, and I'm slowing down a bit. It's I talked to you and you said you'd be happy to review it, and I'm going, the push is to get that content out fast. And the problem is if that content moves it too fast, we lose
Yeah.
accuracy, then we
Yes.
really undermine credibility. So I think that's an excellent point. I want to go to another thing he said is what should a sales professional do after they've discovered they've shared fake content? I think that I have my views on it, but I think that's a great thing because you're going to make mistakes.
Yes, we all do. I mean, it's inevitable. We are all working so fast under such tremendous pressure that getting tripped up at some point is almost inevitable. You're going to see something which you haven't checked properly. You thought it came from a source which you trusted, and that source may have changed or may not even be the source you expected. So you thought you understood it, you share it, and voila, it's not even true. Then what do you say? Well, the natural response to that, which most of us would actually say, oh, you do nothing. You pretend it didn't happen,
La
and
la la la
yeah,
la.
and you hope nobody noticed. The other thing is you say, oh, how can I justify that? That's the other thing. And really what we should be doing is just be transparent, say, well, okay, today this is what happened. I was juggling this and doing that and doing this, and this came across my bows, and I thought this is brilliant, my audience would love this, and I shared it. And you know what, I shouldn't have, because I should have double checked it, and I didn't. And it's fake, so don't believe it, and I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And if you say that, people think, hey, first of all, you're human, right? Which is
Right.
great. And secondly, you think, okay, he cares.
Yeah.
He cares that he made a mistake and he's trying to fix it. So the credibility level actually goes up instead of going down. So, the knee-jerk reaction of doing nothing or ignoring it or trying to justify it, which is understandable because our ego is invested in that and our presence, etc. Well, that will only sort of backfire on us. And really, we should just be transparent and say, okay, I messed up. These are the reasons why. I understand them. I'm going to try really hard not to make the same mistake again.
Which is great. And I'm going to start and say I apologize to all people where they were in my class. I used the boil frog alive metaphor because I can't remember where I said it before. So it's the beginning
Oh,
of it.
a lot of us have shared that one in the past, believe me.
Right. But this is very connected to what I believe are fundamentals of integrity. I have a personal value that's developed over the years that breaking my word or not showing up on time, an apology is not enough. And that's kind of a policy I've made. What is a little effort beyond? And in fact, I've just something happened and I didn't show up for some students, and I found there's someone in the class who has a coffee shop, and I get, would you please get 2 gift cards, and then I'm going to give that to them. And they said, people say, oh, don't worry about it. And I think it's very important to me. No, I need to keep track. I'll make enough mistakes I'm not aware of where I've broken my agreements, implied or intended, to keep my own credibility up. And I see a connection between these two as well.
Absolutely. Yes. I mean, there's work. I mean, every kind of connection works on the basis of the assumption of trust. And that trust can be implicit or it can be explicit. It can be very sort of clearly defined as in a legal document, or it can be sort of through an unwritten law. The moment that trust is broken, in order to repair it, we have to say not just, I'm sorry I broke it, it won't happen again, but also show transparently what steps you're taking to repair it and how the other person can verify that. And this goes through organizations that make mistakes. VW springs to mind very publicly. And they're suffering pretty heavily still because they haven't quite sort of bridged that gap. They haven't shown how we can verify they're repairing it. They have promised and they're paying and they're sort of half paying and making some other half promises, but it's still very murky. So when it comes to, oh, I made a mistake, I'm sorry. Well, yes, you're sorry, but are you sorry because you got caught, or are you sorry because you actually made a mistake? That question, is still there. So you got to say, well, I'm sorry. You can say, I'm sorry I got caught. It'd be great if nobody noticed, but I'm also sorry because I made it, because I shouldn't have done that. And this is what I learned. And this is how you can tell. This is what I'm going to do in the future. And this is how, I'm going to hold myself accountable to that. And I think if we have that kind of approach, trust is reestablished very quickly. If that approach is lacking, well, no, it's, we pretty much go through sort of spin cycle where, it's only a matter of time till we get the next time when you make a mistake. And I'm going to say, well, here we go again.
Yeah, and along that, you gave a good example of VW. Are there others you think would be related to sales as possible examples of fake content that got out? Anything else pops in, because that's kind of a break in trust, but it's a little different than a salesperson pushing out content he thought was new or she thought was new. Go ahead.
The classic examples these days are news organizations, because they're at the forefront of essentially channeling information. And we have almost two camps here. We have established organizations, and the New York Times comes to mind, the BBC, which are very invested in what they do, and they still put a slight spin on it. Sometimes they still get caught out by the speed of reporting something and the pressure to be the first out with it. And they can sometimes make mistakes, they frequently do, where they can spread something which is not essentially true, or they can misrepresent it, or they can misquote it, or they can sort of give a slightly different version of events to something that happened, even though all those events may have happened. And then there's the other organizations which simply don't care. They'll come out with anything which is a spin to whatever preconception, and they'll say, oh, this is what it is, and they'll justify it with any kind of broad enough sort of interpretation of facts in order to cover it. And in both cases, yes, they both make mistakes. And then where we sort of begin to see who is the most credible of the two is by how they then treat those mistakes. And certainly in the case of organizations like the BBC and the New York Times, which have a deep tradition of journalism and journalistic values behind them, they go to quite extreme lengths to publicly acknowledge their mistakes and then fix them, and then explain why they happened. And I can't remember the specific article now on the New York Times, but there was something where they did actually have printed something which was entirely false. And they admitted it, and they said, this is what happened. It was speed. They had to get the drop on the news cycle. They're working under pressure, and they didn't fact check. And they said, okay, they admitted publicly in a sort of as broad a platform as possible that it shouldn't have happened, and it did, and they're to blame. And they explain that they're putting new safeguards in place in order to stop this from happening. Well, that only makes the New York Times, in this particular context and instance, a very human in its approach. You understand the pressures they're operating under. It doesn't take away from their credibility, and you think, okay, trust is still there because they're working really hard to fix this. And then if we go to another organization, and Fox News comes to mind because they very recently removed their logo about, I can't remember what the logo was, but it had something to do with factual reporting on news. They're not even pretending they're doing that. Well, they basically have a wide variety of commentators as presenters who put a specific spin on them, and the range they cover goes from the almost factual, which doesn't make them differentiate very much from a news organization, to so deeply commentating in terms of what's happening that's basically an opinion piece presented as news, and that is pretty wrong.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And now with businesses, let's talk a little bit about liability and things they can do to minimize their salespeople generating fake news. And of course, mine is just make sure their marketing department's doing their homework and delivering it. But we want to empower our salespeople to be autonomous too. And so, any comments on that?
Definitely. And I mean, things are pretty simple. Essentially, if you're an organization, a business organization today, there's no excuse for operating legacy models of the 20th century where everything was compartmentalized and the metrics which you used were hard metrics which had to do simply with bottom line numbers and people's performance in terms of sales and units moved, because this is not how the world works anymore. Things are not compartmentalized. Your audience is very diverse and very large. The potential to do really well is better than ever. The potential to go wrong very quickly is also greater than ever before. So the only way you can tackle this, because it is extremely complex, and the only way you can tackle this in terms of scale and cost is to work on basic principles. If you have truth, really truth and respect for each other and transparency within the organization, well, that is reflected outside it. It's the simplest way to do it. So if you really all have a great working environment, great working relationships, you all believe in what you're doing because you discussed it and you agree it's within your values and everything works, even though we all do it for money, right? Because this is why we work. Well, if you work that way, then work becomes very valuable, and that is projected outside it. And nobody really makes a great mistake. And if you do, you say, hey, shouldn't have happened. This is why I did. If you don't, then you're walking a tightrope. It's only a matter of time before something happens. And again, if we look at things like United Airlines, for instance, and the way they treated that Asian doctor who was thrown off the flight, and then how they responded as a corporation, where they said, he was relocated. And then they very recently had another example of somebody also, it was a musician this time. And it was a case of, she wanted to travel with a violin case because it was a 17th century violin. They grappled with it off her. They wouldn't let her fly. She had to cancel her flight and she had to fly with another airline. Now, these are very public instances. They go a long way towards creating trust by understanding how an organization treats its customers, which allows those customers to feel valued or not. And that also reflects on the way the organization then values its own staff and is sort of the work they do.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to bring up Elise's general question, which is,
Okay.
she's in the trenches coaching people and go, this is all great, but it feels daunting to keep up with the time consumption of double checking everything. And I think you've answered part of this with one, know a few sources to double check information. Two, build a trusted network and know the domain of each individual's trustworthy. Like, I might trust him on the topic of dog training, but I may not trust him on relationship advice. And those are two I think you brought up. Is there other things you'd mention on, in this rapidly moving world, how to kind of keep up? Am I sharing fake content or not?
Yeah, I think it is critical to establish a sense of mission, purpose, and identity in the organization itself. And these three things essentially are inherently wrapped up in a sense of value, both within the values that we hold as individuals, then the corporate values, but also then externally, the value that we create in every kind of transaction we have with our audience, whether the transaction is a sale, or it's exchange of information, or it's a sharing of a piece of news, or anything else. So essentially, if we manage to have this kind of approach where the identity and values and a sense of who we are very deeply ingrained, then it is very easy to empower individuals to do the legwork when they absolutely have to. And that's the real money-saving approach. This is the only true valuable way of actually scaling anything. Otherwise, you're creating so many levels of checks and balances and counter checks that essentially you're adding a lot to the operating costs of anything. Your social media team um, won't be able to operate the way it should. You're also making everything very sort of top heavy, because you need to take to have things checked by different management levels before you can tweet anything or even put any kind of blog post out. And that sort of defeats the entire purpose of spontaneity and authenticity and realness that makes us value things on the web. So the approach, as we get more and more technological, as we get more and more technical, as the technology gets more and more granular and everything becomes faster, we essentially find ourselves on a digital equivalent of the global village, where suddenly we step outside or step inside our computer and find ourselves in the sort of metaphorical village square with all the stalls there and people sort of going by. And the only way that we can deal with this is by being more human, not less, in the fullest sense of the word. And is it a challenge? Yes, it is, because we're still operating, a lot of companies still operate legacy models where humanity is not really prized, where soft skills are not priced, and what we're looking at is resumes and what sort of hard skills have you got, and can you operate this computer? Do you know the software package? Have you got an MBA? Well, yeah, I mean, these are technical things, but this is not what actually makes a corporation win. We need the soft skills. Can you generate trust? Can you be transparent and honest? Can you be intuitive? Can you be proactive? Can you show initiative? Can you maintain your sense of value when you're under pressure? So, these are the things which really matter, and they only come into the surface if we have that human connection. Lacking that, everything else is sort of held by force, and force eventually weakens or falters or fails, and things go wrong.
Which is similar to a side conversation we had about machine learning and its role in this. And one definition I let you off the hook of providing, and I'm always worried I'm going to mispronounce it. It starts with the V for truthfulness in big data. And you mentioned it early
Veracity,
on.
yes,
Let's say it
yes.
again.
Veracity,
Veracity.
yes.
I want you to define that, because we'll probably get more and more tools of veracity and big data that hopefully will help us identify the truthfulness along with our own awareness. And what your some comments on that, but just start with defining veracity.
Yes, essentially, this is one of the characteristics of big data. Everything which we see in terms of information has volume and sort of velocity and variety, which are the three things which we see with every kind of popular piece of information. What we don't actually realize, and this is the critical one, is veracity. It is how truthful is it? How close to the facts are the things which we actually see? And we have developed tools which allow us to gauge the effectiveness and the values of the first three. We know about volume, we know about velocity and how quickly news spreads. It is easy to count reshares and plus ones and likes and so on. We can see variety in how citations and repurposing of information comes along. Veracity has always been a little bit of a bugbear. It's been a bit of a bugbear because essentially, in order for that to happen, this is where things get a little bit technical, we need to have trustworthy sources. Not us as people, because we usually create our own, but from a machine point of view. So if we look at Google search, for instance, which everybody uses, it needs to have trusted entities, and entities are basically data points which are now trustworthy because they're indisputable. And those entities act as a primary filter for the information it actually accesses, which allow it to be truthful or not. And to give an example here, suppose you get something breaking news on Twitter and you say, earthquake in Chile, 10,000 dead. You think, did somebody tweet that at midnight so it's a hoax, or this is really happening? You check the news and nothing, crickets. Well, it's likely it's a hoax, right?
Mhm.
But if you check the news and BBC is reporting something happening in Chile and CNN is reporting the same and NBC, well, you think, okay, something is happening in Chile and perhaps there may not be 10,000 dead, but there may be many thousand dead because somebody tweeted that. And essentially, if that tweet is there and so on, if you get then somebody who actually happens to be in Chile and is known to you, or it's a high sort of value person, then you begin to filter it. Now search can do the same thing, and can do it a lot faster, can do it a lot more accurately. And the question is, well, if it's so easy, why isn't it happening? Well, it isn't happening because although it is extremely easy to happen in a limited data set where there are very hard boundaries, in the wild web where information flows through so many different websites from almost any kind of source, the signals which we get from that are very complicated, and it's very difficult to verify very quickly still. It won't be the case forever, but at the moment it is. And to give an example, suppose somebody is perpetrating a hoax, okay, and we can use a website like InfoWars, for instance. We think that the Sandy Hook is a hoax perpetrated by actors to drive the gun control conversation, even though there are people factually who lost family members in this tragedy. Now, if they sort of spread this far enough and wide enough, we're going to get volume, we're going to get variety, and we're going to get velocity. So the three signals which are hard signals which we can measure, which allow us to sort of interpret the impact of a piece of news and from there gauge its importance, well, they're going to be there for something which is essentially fake. What will not be there, of course, is the veracity count. Now, that as people, we can tell straight away. You get to InfoWars and they're talking about, Lady Gaga having sort of some kind of satanic rites hidden in her lyrics. So you think, okay, not to be taken too seriously. But you go, you take the same piece of information and give it to a machine. That machine can't quite yet make that connection. It still lacks the complexities which our own brain filters so quickly. So eventually we'll get there, but at this point in time, depending on where the information came from, it's a 50-50, it's a coin toss. Maybe it'll be right, maybe it'll be wrong. And this is what Google is struggling with. This is what pretty much everybody else is struggling with. Now, very recently, because Google has come under a lot of pressure from fake news, they're beginning to increase the budget allocated to the network of trusted entities they have within YouTube for now. So in YouTube, there are people who are human operators whom they trust, who look at content and then decide, okay, this video, for instance, this is where it gets really hard. This video does say contentious things. Yes, it does talk about religious restrictions or ethnic sort of restrictions or whatever, but it's basically educational. And this video talks about the same thing in a slightly different tone, and it's hate mongering. We can tell as people, machines can't. But because Google is willing to do this through human raters, it will be able to train its algorithm to get better than the 50-50% that it's 50-50 that's at the moment. And that will make things a little easier. If it becomes easy in YouTube, which is the second largest, I think it's actually the largest search engine in the world right now, then it begins to filter into other things, and we'll see an increasing level of trustworthiness within the mechanistic interfaces we use. And search is one, but there are a lot of other ones.
It looks like if Twitter could break through this veracity, hopefully I'm getting it right, veracity, and take all that massive data it has and be able to pick out more of the truthfulness in its little news updates, it could become a amazingly authoritarian source. And I think it looks like they've been trying it, because I remember when they first started, did they call it insights or whether the latest news,
Yes.
that's going on. And I said for years, if Twitter would use machine learning and attempt to filter out the hearsay from the news, they could be a force to reckon in news information, because they have so much volume and data. And I'm not sure they're not at least looking at it, because I'll sometimes see something and I'll go there and look at their top news as one of my points of verification.
Twitter is an interesting case, because essentially anything within the parameters of freedom of speech and the fast sharing of information, anything goes, literally. So yes, indeed, we can have a verified profile with a history and a picture and a person and a bio saying something, and then we can have a profile that has 2 followers, was created yesterday, and has a picture of a goat as an avatar, and that will also be able to spread the same kind of news. And the real issue here is that both profiles may be equally valid within different contexts, because if they one with a picture of a goat happens to come out of an authoritarian regime, like perhaps Bolivia or China or Peru or any of those places, then it has great value. And obviously you don't want that person to be broadcasting who they are, because the stakes are so high. So this is the issue Twitter is struggling with. There, it comes down to resources. Google certainly has a lot more resources than Twitter, and its aggregation of data is a lot broader, which allows it to do what it does. Twitter is deeper and more limited in terms of resources, and that's a challenge in its own right. It's a challenge of its success, really, because it sort of filters through so much information. Will they be able at some point to get to it? It depends. I mean, theoretically, they should be able to. So we're just watching at the moment.
Excellent. Well, I think we've explored this topic of truthfulness in news, and hopefully scratched the surface for the listeners, and want to hear people's comments and other things, because we'd enjoy to hear what they have to say, or what we might have left out that's important to say as well. But I want to wrap up with asking you, how can people learn more about your work, and mention your upcoming book in November, because I'm very excited. We've talked offline about it, about learning from it.
Yes, thank you very much for this. Yes, upcoming book. It's coming out in November. It's called The Sniper Mind. It was 3-year deep journey into neuroscientific research, and obviously snipers. I talked about 100 of them, but essentially what it is, I've brought out insights of how the brain operates under pressure, how we can then use that knowledge to optimize our own thinking, our own decision making, our own practices, so we become more effective human beings. So this is what it's really about. It's there to help business people, help entrepreneurs, help solopreneurs, or anybody who is interested in optimizing their thinking. So it's got a pretty broad brief and very practical steps. People can find me on Twitter at David Amerland, which is my handle, or they can find me from my website, davidamerland.com, and now increasingly at thesnipermind.com.
All right. Excellent. Excellent. Well, we're going to wrap up just to ask people again, our sponsor, our selling.training, check it out and use it. And also we ask, if you got value out of the show, please go to iTunes or whatever platform you're on and write a comment or review. We want to hear it, and we want to get feedback from everyone involved in it. And you can contact us. You'll see the links of all our resources. We're linking into sales, the links for our Twitter account, our LinkedIn group, our Facebook group, all of those. We want to hear more of your views on it. And David, I just really thank you. This was, I hope our listeners enjoyed our journey as much as I did. And I look forward to us finding the next challenging conversation to have on this. Thank you so much for joining us today on Social Selling with Linking into Sales. And I'll let you have the final word here.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity. I really enjoyed this. And I think for every one of our listeners, I know the challenges. I know it looks really complicated. The easiest way to cut through all that complexity is to just be human, because that's real and that is really hard to fake.
That's great. That's great. Well, thanks so much. It's great having you again. Watch out for our show notes, and we'll get some of those resources you gave and add them there too.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you.